what we would change if we had a time machine to go back in time with some of our best ball teams. That is what we're talking about today. And of course, Shawn, this show is coming out the 25th of December, Christmas Day, for those who celebrate. Happy holidays to anyone who is either celebrating, but if you're not celebrating, hopefully you are celebrating advancing your fantasy football teams this weekend in NFL Week 16. We are, Shawn, recording this on Thursday, the 24th of December. We are hoping that the team we talk about today is advancing to the finals, which would take them finishing in the top 2 this week to advance into the 50-team final next week for a shot at $50,000. We thought this would be a little fun thing to talk about, some of the players and the decisions that we would have made at the time, what we might have changed, and some of the things that maybe even when we recap this draft, I don't think came out of the blue, but the success when you look back now at draft boards can be really, really interesting to look at. So we are set up here, Shawn, a 12-team pod. Shout out to Curtis Patrick as well, one of the other 11 competitors that is facing off against us this week. So I think we'll run through the team so people, as they listen to this on Monday or Tuesday, can say, that player did great, that player did great, that player did great. Oh, this is a great team. These guys definitely advanced. I say that in jest, but I'm also hoping that is true. So, Shawn, it is titled Have a Good One. It is Justin Fields, Sam Howell, a quarterback, just the 2 quarterbacks in this team. So obviously when we did see Sam Howell coming out of the lineup in week 15, that was a concern. Hopefully he's played all the way through week 16 here and has had a big day. We have Breece Hall, we have James Cook, Ty Chandler, Tank Bigsby, Roschon Johnson. We have the superhero off this roster, Christian McCaffrey, Chase Claypool, Jordan Addison, Jalen Hyatt, Quentin Johnson, Marvin Mims, Rashee Rice, Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Jahan Dodson, Kyle Pitts, Cole Kmet. We do have Greg Dulcich, who has been on injured reserve, but the rest of the team pretty healthy. There is some names in there, as people would have probably thought going through it, that we won't expect a huge amount from over this week, and if we did advance to the final. But you never know who you need, Shawn. Quentin Johnson did make the team here last week ahead of Sam Howell because it is the Superflex format. But Shawn, as we kick off this one, I think more so than anything, before we talk about the players and the team and so on, I do want to give a shout out to all of the RotoViz Overtime community, because we've made it to this point of the season through the 16 weeks, and it has been phenomenal to have interaction with the community. Both, Shawn has done some drafts with some of the contest winners from earlier this season. He's got to know them more. I've got to know people through some Twitter conversations, through some emails, different chats, and so on and so forth. And it's always amazing to talk with people in the community that has been built here and has been built through RotoViz as well. So I just want to give a thank you to everyone who does listen, and we are very grateful to each and every one of you that does listen in. And again, as I said at the start, whether you're celebrating the Christmas holidays or you're just listening to the podcast, thank you very much, and I hope you're having a great time of the year here as we enter 2024, on which will hopefully be a positive note.
And I would just echo that sentiment. It's been so much fun, and it's been so much fun to hear of the successes that people have had when had somebody who, I've drafted with reach out and say that they got 10 teams through to the Best Ball Mania semifinals. Like, it's so cool. And Colm, I feel like the draft episodes have been successful, right? I mean, you and I obviously have this draft. We have our main event draft. The team that Ben and I drafted for the main event did extremely well, at least in the first week. We hope, as you're listening, it's done well again. The team that he and I drafted for Best Ball Mania advanced. One of the teams that Pete and I drafted on the Best Ball Banana Stand, which you could listen to on our Best Ball feed, advanced to the semifinals. The team that drafted with Pat for his marathon advanced to the semifinals. So many cool drafts there. And we know that the teams that Curtis and Dave did as well were very successful. So we know that not everybody can win every league. Certainly we don't win every league, not by a long shot, but to have done teams for the shows that have made it deep, it at least gives me some encouragement that it was probably helpful for listeners. So we're hoping that you have had a really fun final kind of month to this season, and you're in great shape here as we go into the holidays. Colm, in this particular team, we're going to look at some of the things we did, some of the things that we wish we had done, some of the things we're celebrating about 2023. And we had the 9th pick. As you're looking through these super flexes, the number one sort of pivotal foundational point, you want to call it, for our strategy was that if you are given a QB who is an impact player, you take him. If you are not, then you load up on the best players from other positions and you make the late round QB element work for you, which we've demonstrated and written a lot about how both of those work. So it's not a one or the other, but it's you have to adjust to your specific draft slot and your specific draft. In our draft, Travis Kelce went 108, and that put Justin Fields down to us at 109. For me, that gave us a chance to do what we had done the previous year when we took Jalen Hurts, and that pushed us to the finals. Fields, the last QB who would fit the category of players that I wanted to draft. The next 3 guys who went off were Trevor Lawrence, Deshaun Watson, and Aaron Rodgers, in part because of injuries and in part because of underperformance. We know how that has worked out. We feel very fortunate that we were able to get Fields. He had some injuries. He's not always been the highest scoring quarterback. He certainly hasn't been what Jalen Hurts was the previous year, but I'm excited to see what he can hopefully do these last couple of weeks. And then as we wrap back around, we were able to get Christian McCaffrey. That's the perfect 1-2 punch for me when we look at how a draft starts out of the 109.
Yeah, and what I did before we recorded today was look through all the rounds and kind of look where you would change it. So was it a case that we picked Christian McCaffrey at 204 and we could have picked somebody else that went 3 picks later, or vice versa? So in this, Justin Fields, you mentioned the quarterbacks that went after. There's picks throughout all of this, though. So even picks that haven't necessarily worked out, like, and I mentioned haven't worked out, but he was in our lineup last week, Quentin Johnson, Jahan Dodson, Kyle Pitts. When you look through the players that went post those players, and that's something we'll do in a moment, is some of the players that we may have changed. The majority of them, though, Shawn, throughout this draft, and drafting at 9, you obviously have the 10, 11, 12 turn to consider those 6 players. There isn't a huge amount of them that if we changed the players that went after us, that would have made a huge difference, especially through the opening 10, 11 rounds. So players went before us, the likes of a Jalen Waddle went 2 picks before Chris Olave, for example. But looking down through it, Justin Fields, Christian McCaffrey seems like a perfect start at the time. And we haven't got the high points from Fields, but who knows if we get them this week or next week in week 16, 17. But the upside is there in that particular play. And Christian McCaffrey, at the running back position, you really couldn't have done any better this season. We move in then, though, Shawn, when we drafted this team, obviously, we have a healthy Aaron Rodgers at that point. We'd take Garrett Wilson at the 309. Players that went before him was quarterback. Players that went after was quarterback. Potentially would have been a conversation with Jared Goff, but the talent around Wilson was something that we were so bought into that we, I think, still would have went very much in that direction. Anthony Richardson, Kenny Pickett, Devontae Adams, Derrick Henry, Jalen Waddle, Calvin Ridley then went off the board. We took Chris Olave at that point. So I really don't think around there's any conversation of what we would change, but I'm sure as we drafted Chris Olave, Shawn, I probably was making the case for T. Higgins, who went as the next wide receiver. That was after Derek Carr and Russell Wilson. So the 407 was T. Higgins. But as we look through the season, that's probably a bit of a wash. But, Chris Olave has missed quite a bit of time. T. Higgins missed time too, but had a big week last week. But thankfully we scraped through and advanced. We get down then, Shawn, into an interesting zone because we took Breece Hall, 1 pick ahead of Kenneth Walker. And I think that that's still the best pick. We had 2 options there as to who we would want to go with. But after that, we did Kyle Pitts at the 604. And I think it's fair to say that that hasn't worked out to the way that we would have hoped for. But the player that you probably would take out of the following list that we could have went for is Travis Etienne. So it was Terry McLaurin, James Conner, Travis Etienne, Brock Purdy, Kittle, Ritter, Hopkins, Christian Watson, Javonte Williams, Damian Pierce, DJ Moore, Mike Williams, Rashad White, Drake London. And then it comes back to where we get Sam Howell. Now, I think it's fair to say that if we had a known in hindsight how the season works out and you wanted to take the highest scoring player without any considerations, DJ Moore and Rashad White would be your pick there over Kyle Pitts. But with how we were trying to build this team into get, which we were hoping would still turn into be an elite tight end, I still think that would have been the play we made. But the one thing, taking Pitts into consideration here with this part of the conversation, when I talk about the 12th round picks that we made, And then further down the draft, we did miss out on Trey McBride. And I do think the pick of Pitts at this point factored into our decision to allow Sam Laporta and McBride to try and get them back around to us rather than to take them off the board at the points that they went in the 12th round and 17th round. So obviously in hindsight, Shawn, it wasn't the best selection, but looking at the players available in that zone, I still think from that perspective of the talent profile we were looking for and to get a tight end, I think it probably still was the right decision. How do you decide on that? Where is it the right decision, but it's the wrong result?
Yeah, the tight end tactics on this team are the one area that I do have some questions about, like really what we were thinking.
And for people who want to find out, this draft was reposted last Thursday if you want to find out the exact reason.
One of the things that I did run into a little bit, and this can cut both ways, but sometimes people will ask me, well, Shawn, why do you keep drafting your favorite guys? Aren't you scared of having J.K. Dobbins get injured in week 1? And the answer is, yeah, I mean, you are scared. But Sam Laporta is someone where my overall exposure was literally around the 50% mark. And so there were some late drafts, and this was a mid-August draft. So not like the latest of drafts, but certainly when starting to get into that range, because we had been drafting these, from the never too early stage all the way through. There were some drafts where we tried to diversify a little bit, and you're thinking about that already when you make the Kyle Pitts selection, because one of the things with Pitts is that through most of the year, we didn't really draft him. And then as you get closer and you're thinking, we should create some exposure in case the previous season's thesis hit. I mean, we're still talking about a guy who had that fantastic rookie year. For him to bounce back in year 3, if the offense is functional, that doesn't take some massive leap of faith. All it takes is some subtle changes with the Falcons. That didn't happen, but I think it makes sense to set yourself up to get Kyle Pitts at a good price there, because one of the things that we're looking to do from a structural perspective on this team is to get the anchor QB, to get 2 foundation running backs and 2 foundation receivers. So the Superflex drafts are a little bit different than what we're trying to do in the other FFPC drafts, right? So the double foundation at running back, the double foundation at receiver, along with a foundation QB and a tight end, the RCE really likes that. And I think that beyond just the fact that the last several years, the history that we're pulling in with the RCE, beyond that, it's very easy to understand why that would be effective over a large number of seasons, a large number of different types of events, why that would work. So we're trying to set that up. I would love to go back and have Travis Etienne, even with how poorly he's played in the last month, or how poorly he's scored, I should say. But we're not necessarily needing to get to the 3rd running back at that spot, because of the limits that you have with the flex position, right? So you're not necessarily looking for the 3rd running back there. The other thing is that we do know we're going to have to take our 2nd and 3rd QBs. So if you don't take Kyle Pitts right there, then what you're probably going to do is select from what I believe the 3 similar players that we were looking at there with Brock Purdy, Desmond Ridder, and Sam Howell. Obviously, Purdy has been, Ben and I just released a Brock Purdy MVP debate episode. The fact that exists gives you a pretty good sense of what Purdy has done. Ridder, so poor to the point of getting benched a couple times. Sam Howell, more in between, but with the volume on most occasions where, he's been a huge key to getting teams through. He's certainly a huge key in Superflex formats where having an inexpensive QB has been pivotal. He has been the league winner, even with the foibles, right? Yeah. The other thing that the RCE tells you is that if you can wait after you take your first QB, if you can wait through that wave, and the area we took Garrett Wilson, again, I think illustrates it so well, because you're talking about Daniel Jones, Jared Goff, Anthony Richardson, Kenny Pickett. Yeah, Goff has been good, but 3 of those 4 guys get hurt and didn't have probably the league-winning kind of scenario. Anyway, the next guy is Derek Carr, Russell Wilson. You're talking about drafting in a range that doesn't help you as much as hitting the right guy later. So again, structurally it works. If you have Richardson stay healthy and he runs for a bunch of touchdowns, maybe that's a little bit different. But so again, the structure here I love. If you put Purdy in for Pitts and then you put Laporta in for Kmet, then you're talking about this team being one that had one going away, one where we're like, oh, we've got it. We're gonna advance this week. We're gonna be a real threat in the finals. That would be the tweak that I would make. If you could put Brock Purdy in there, you take Sam Howell back through round 7, you draft James Cook again like we did in round 8. Now you're talking about this perfect first 8 rounds. Get Jordan Addison in round 10. I mean, you're off to the races. You're going to win the whole thing. Those would be the tweaks. But I like what we did at the time. I think it made a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think it made sense. And that's when you're looking through your process and what you change, I think they're the key things to be looking into. The Brock Purdy pick, for people looking at 608, quarterback 23 in Superflex format. That is, if you're circling through this draft, there's him and there's CJ Stroud, who did go QB 30 at the 8-11. Those are the 2 picks, Shawn, I think that just amazing. If you could make them, it would be the ideal way to go around and go in your time machine and do your Superflex drafts. Just pick those 2 guys up, load up on everyone else throughout the rest of the draft. But we do have Sam Howell, then James Cook at the 8-4, Jahan Dodson, Jordan Addison, Quentin Johnson. But the Cole Kmet, Sam Laporta one was the one where I think that we probably were balancing out our sheets of how much Sam Laporta we were packing at that point. So we had Cole Kmet went as tight end 16, 12.04. Sam Laporta went tight end 17 at 12.07. And I'm pretty convinced we thought we would slide him back through. And then the Greg Dulcich.
So Colm, you've posted this and you've worked through it with listeners and whatnot. Obviously, Cole Kmet there, somebody we did like, and we were drafting quite a bit when he fell. So our prices on Kmet were also very good this season, in addition to him having a good year. In this particular draft, having Justin Fields at the top and putting those 2 guys together would certainly be a consideration.
Yeah.
But, I mean, we passed on Sam Laporta in the 12th round. What was our thought process there?
It was unforgivable. Just unacceptable, Shawn. We get an F for this draft.
And you don't necessarily have to load up quite to the same extent on tight end and Superflex as the regular format. One of the things that we talked a lot on the shows, and I've gotten a lot of feedback, Colm, that it helped people, was that the RCE really wants you to take 4 in the regular format. And when you did take 4 this year, there have been so many magical things that have happened for those teams, in part because once you get to 4, the chances that you took Trey McBride when he's one of your targets start to get really high. So we like that. Anytime you take 4 and you hit on one, it's going to be a lot different than taking 4 and not hitting on any. So again, the player himself does matter. But Colm, we don't get to the 4 here. It is something where, in retrospect, you're like, why didn't we just take Sam Laporta when we took Quentin Johnston? But Johnston is one of the guys I don't have a lot of regret for, because I think you have to target that profile in that situation with the Justin Herbert. The Jahan Dotson pick is one that has been more harmful, and yet that's one that goes with Sam Howell. The main thing here is that Dotson has not been anything like what we anticipated, certainly what the Commanders thought they were getting from a first-round pick. He's been disappointing because we've talked a lot about how Addison is somebody who had that type of Calvin Ridley-esque rookie season and has been big. Jahan Dotson, to a slightly lesser extent, was in that same basic type of template. And his season behind a Terry McLaurin, certainly disastrous, what have you. He hasn't taken the step to move past McLaurin. Both of those guys, I think you could argue, have been a little bit limited by the need to get rid of the ball quickly, the need that the Commanders have had to mitigate the sacks. And they've both been arguably casualties of the offense that the Commanders have built to limit the sacks, where it's maybe less damaging to a player like a Curtis Samuel, maybe less damaging to the backs getting some catches out of the backfield there. So we'll have to see how that evolves. As we're discussing it right now, we don't even know if Sam Howell survived a game against the New York Jets, which,
Shawn,
that's a tough game. So Greg Dulcich, Colm, we know we don't want that pick. Who would you have selected in round 13 instead?
Well, this is the part again about when you're doing the draft and what you're doing in the moment with a live draft. So Cole Kmet went as tight end 16, as I mentioned. Then it was Laporta, but at the 13 turn, it is Irv Smith goes, Joanne Johnson goes, Luke Musgrave goes in the way back. So you're starting to get into a limited territory. And Shawn, remembering back to August time, draft time, Greg Dulcich was somebody who, I was drafting quite a considerable amount of based on what we were hoping would have happened this season and how he had kind of flashed at times, I guess, in his career so far as a rookie. So there was a lot of positivity in my mind around Dulcich. So when we had the 2 tight ends, and as you mentioned, looking to get to 4, but at that point getting to 3, the options after that are quite limited as to what we would have probably been targeting outside of the Trey McBride being the one that we would have really wanted. Hunter Henry went in the 14th round, somebody who we were drafting from time to time, and Michael Mayer went at 1801. There's some of these guys that we were targeting. So when we look at it after his pick, Shawn, it's Jameson Williams, Zay Jones, Tyler Boyd, KJ Osborne, Dawson Knox, Jeff Wilson. We take Rashee Rice, then it's Jacoby Myers, Raheem Mostert. Again, if you're saying who's the perfect pick there, it is Raheem Mostert. But at that point in the conversation, what we probably would have been better to do is take Rice and then take Mostert. But I think, again, going back and doing it, I'm probably still targeting the upside and the tight end premium off a Dulcich at that point of the draft season. Obviously now that's not the right decision, but at the time I think I would still have been comfortable with the call we made. Rice was the receiver I would have wanted at that point. I know you may have been pushing towards a Jameson Williams, but we got the receiver we wanted in the following round, and at that point I felt we didn't miss out on a huge amount. So the player I wish we had was Raheem Mostert.
And he was somebody who showed up just, very shortly after that on the 0 RB candidates countdown. So you would have loved to have him there. Jacoby Myers, somebody that
the other reason, Shawn,
looking
at this team, we have Christian McCaffrey, Breece Hall, and James Cook at that point. So we have 3 running backs through 8 rounds in a Superflex format. So I would have been very comfortable with our running backs there to not be needing to push Mostert into the conversation.
And I think in some of these situations, part of what you're thinking is, okay, I've got guys later that I'm still comfortable with. And so you pass on someone like a Mostert who ends up being a star, and then you kind of regret it, and maybe you make worse decisions in the future because you don't want to miss on that guy. You've got to balance those things. You've got to make sure that you continue to go back and look at the specific players. And when you are doing your postmortem, be fair with yourself. You want to be critical of yourself, but also fair with yourself as you're doing that. The players that we do take later, we do hit on a Ty Chandler. He was crucial for us this week. So having that pick in there is one of the things that we're looking at.
Do you mean week 15 or the week 16 that hasn't happened yet?
I'm going to change it to what I actually meant. I'm going to say week 16. Let's say he hit again. That would be the good story there. The other thing with Dulcich is that after that, we think about, how did the 4 tight end work? It feels like a season where you got a lot of late round tight end value. But the reality is that after Dulcich goes off, the only other player that we really wanted was Trey McBride. And my supposition on missing McBride is that we thought he was going to be cheaper and would come back. This is one of those situations where
off the board later, that was an earlier pick for him.
Yeah. And so one of the mistakes you can make is to occasionally pass on someone to maximize the number of players you get from your board, but pass on the player you have ranked higher and then not have him fall to you. Now, the counterbalance there is simply that by forcing yourself to have that type of discipline, you don't run into this issue of continuing to pay higher and higher prices for your target and get your exposure so high that it causes you problems. So you can help both your exposures and the prices that you're paying, the average ADP that you have, or the average, it's not ADP, but your own average price will stay at a reasonable range when you enforce that discipline. But then when you look back at the end of the season and you're like, how do we have a team that's advanced to this point and it doesn't have Laporta and it doesn't have McBride when those were our 2 main targets?
This is basically the only team I think that I have without at least one of those guys on the FFPC, and it's the one that's got true.
So that can be the frustrating part. But the only other player who's really been a big impact guy is Jake Ferguson. So once Dulcich is gone, there aren't a lot of other players that you would necessarily want, but there are a lot of tight ends drafted. And most of those tight ends are still basically giving you holes in your roster. You like the overall structure there. Colm, we come back in round 15 and we take a guy that I was taking a little bit of just to make sure I wasn't completely wrong. Anytime that you were right and you hedged, you're like, why didn't I go with 0? But again, you've got to be fair in both directions. There is a world in which ETN gets hurt and Bigsby doesn't play so poorly, but I certainly wish we had someone other than Tank Bigsby.
This was 1,000,000%, Shawn. This was a balance in the books pick. That's the only reason we made this decision, was we had drafted so much ETN that we thought we would kind of, like you're saying, in case we were wrong on that side. And this one is where I think there's a clear, better pick, who I think even at the time we probably would have rather had if we hadn't have been taking the ETN side into it, and that is Chuba Hubbard. So we take Tank Bigsby at the 1509, then it's MVS, Van Jefferson, Tyler Conklin, and then Chuba Hubbard, and then Dante Foreman, and he would have been somebody I would have probably even considered at that point. But Hubbard has been a smash over the last number of weeks, but he is somebody that we've liked for quite some time. And I mentioned my two favorite Superflex teams that both got eliminated, unfortunately, in week 15, that had crossover of a lot of players, but Hubbard was in both of those rosters. He advanced on a lot of teams, and this was one where, again, I think the divergence from our other picks might have got us here, Shawn, with the Tanks Bigsby one. The other one then shortly after that is we do draft Roschon Johnson, who I think is still a pretty solid pick, but the part that really stabs you on that one is he's the 1604. We pass on Trey McBride there. He goes at the 1706. So there's a couple, like, this team is only a few picks away from being, and it has advanced to the semifinals at this point. So it is a good team, but an absolute juggernaut. You mentioned the Purdy pick earlier, for example, if it's in there, but if Trey McBride's in this roster versus, or Sam Laporta versus what we have, it's just an amazing spot. So if you take out Kyle Pitts and you added in Brock Purdy, who went 4 picks later, and then you don't even have to worry about Mostert, but slot in those other guys, it's just incredible. I feel like it's only probably 4 picks out from being easily the most being confident going into the semi-final that you have the best team remaining. Whereas at this point, you're like, let's just get through and see what happens. The other last thing, Shawn, that I was going to mention, which is I think fun from a strategy point of view, is we took Jalen Hyatt at 20.4, so the 2004. Tank Dell goes at 20.08, so 4 picks later. Tank Dell was a superstar all season in terms of putting up huge numbers in the early parts versus Jalen Hyatt, who didn't. But this is the interesting part, is this team advanced through its group. It advanced through the semifinals without the points really of Hyatt. And now you're in a situation in this particular week where Tank Dell can't give us any points the next 2 weeks. So it's always interesting when a team advances as to how the luck may break over the next 2 weeks. And if Hyatt did have a big game versus Tank Dell, who was clearly the better pick at that point, it can work out in different scenarios. And the other last note I want to mention on this is, one thing, sorry, you mentioned Jake Ferguson. He was the tight end 25, just for reference for people who are wondering where these players were going. That was at the 1501. But Shawn, one Puka Nacua undrafted. This draft was, I will double check this before we end the show, but I believe this was the first weekend in August that we drafted this roster. The Bulls hadn't obviously got to a significant point. I've just checked, the 8th of August at 4 p.m. Eastern, we drafted this one. So that would have been a pick we could have slotted in there in the 20th round. That would have been nice as well.
Yeah, I mean, you're just always glad that
nobody
a player who was that good, mostly slipped through these, because competing with those rosters would be tough. There's also the element where, certainly not all, but since Puka didn't have the big week last week, he is now on fewer rosters going forward. So again, hopefully he doesn't beat you. I like the Hyatt pick a lot. And even though the Giants have some serious problems, it's not that long removed from a big game from Hyatt. I think that pick made sense. The picks here that I go back and look at, and again, in retrospect, you could just fix all of these things. But Roschon Johnson, a thinner pick than Tyjae Spears, who goes a few slots later. Chase Claypool, our 19th round pick, is just, it's an excruciatingly terrible pick. And you try to think through why those guys are on the roster. And they're on the roster because of the first round quarterback. And so you want to be aware of stacking together players with your QB and the value that that can bring to you, and the tactical benefits in contests. And yet it's very important, I think, to avoid this mindset of drafting like you're right to the point where you just simply make obviously bad picks and force it. And partly you're thinking, well, it's round 19. How much can it hurt you? Well, just take a complete swing at a very wide range of outcomes player. And people are always like, when you do that all the time, you have a bunch of throwaway picks in your roster too, except Puka and Tank both hit after this spot. You want to be willing to have the humility to understand that maybe your evaluation is not in that spot on those guys, and yet simply the uncertainty is very valuable in a way that simply drafting a player off of the same team as your quarterback is not. And so those would be the things that I would note. Certainly if Claypool had hit, we'd be looking at it differently, but frankly, the chances of Claypool hitting with what you know about the different parts of his profile were essentially zero. And so don't make picks like that. That'd be my recommendation.
It will be fun, and if we are recording our Tuesday show and it's a situation where the Miami Dolphins have got the result against the Dallas Cowboys, but it is because of a late deep touchdown to Chase Claypool. Very unlikely, Shawn, but you never know. But just final note on this roster, quite unique outside of 3 players. We only have Christian McCaffrey, as you'd expect, James Cook, as you'd expect, and Rashee Rice, who over the week 15 obviously would have helped a lot of teams advance. There is 4 James Cook, 4 Christian McCaffrey, and 5 Rashee Rice teams in our 12-team pod here for the semi-final. But beyond that, each of our other players has a maximum of 1 other manager, and then a lot of them sitting there with 1 player. And the players, Shawn, this is the unfortunate part for us. The players that we want to, have massive main event weeks here. We mentioned Sam Laporta on this one. Sam Laporta on 6 teams. We do not have him. So that's 50% of the other roster. So he's somebody, to be honest, I just hope he has a massive week, but this is the Kyle Pitts week where he matches it. And then Devin Singletary on 4 teams, Gibbs on 4 teams, Jordan Love on 3. Then you're down to Terry McLaurin, Deebo Samuel, Gus Edwards on 3. So interesting split. And it's always interesting to look across the pods. I mentioned Tom Strachan on one of the shows last week. He was sharing his 12-team division with me. I believe he only had 1 Sam Laporta team in that. So the way it balances across can be very interesting. We're hoping this team is in with a chance and can have advanced, either is already comfortably in first or second, or is sweating Monday Night Football. But we're getting towards the end of the show. Thank you to anyone who has sat along, listened to this point. We hope you're having a good day, have a good week. Hopefully your teams are going well for you. But again, thanks to everyone who tunes in. We will have some more shows before the new year, but the easiest way to get all of the episodes is subscribe to the RotoViz Overtime podcast channel. Get them once they are available. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. As always, check his work on rotoviz.com. And Shawn, I should sign off the show today by wishing you a happy holidays, and hopefully we've had a nice day here as we sit on Christmas Day and have not had to record our regular podcast. But happy holidays to you.
Well, you as well, Colm. And
this is a real bonus for people who heard the start of the sign off and then stayed. They didn't turn off the podcast at the show is over. Now we're having an extra part here for them.
The show, well, Breece Hall, that's the prediction. 35 points this past week. He carries us through.
We're the only Breece Hall team, Shawn. Let's go, Breece.
Let's go, Breece Hall. Good luck to everybody. Have a happy holidays. We love you guys.
Have a good one.